Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. Hope you'll enjoy listening. This one is from Bionicme. It's in their survivability series. It's about Banshee in Warframe and the combat stealth fantasy. There's an idea that's been haunting me in a good way for over a decade now, since the early days of Warframe, the build or playstyle of combat stealth. What I mean by this is gameplay where you participate in active combat, not sneaking around before the alarms are sounded, but stay largely unnoticed by the enemies you're fighting without using full-on invisibility. Right, which in many games... What? Huh? Can you do that? Is that a thing that exists? In Warframe, potentially yes. Stealth combat in general is interesting in that it often involves two layers. You have the situation before the alarms are sounded. Enemies don't know you're there. You pick off a lone guard and nobody notices. You're undetected. Then, of course, there would be if you jumped in and shot 3 people right in front of their fellow guardsmen, and then they would know you were there. You were detected. But then the interesting thing is that in many stealth action-y, vaguely action-y games, there's something in the middle here, and that is combat stealthing, I guess. In a lot of games, this means you are undetected, but the enemies are looking for you. In Warframe, there, I would argue, kinda, sorta isn't as much of that layer. People who play a lot of Warframe might be saying, well, technically that's in the game. Yeah, but you see what I mean. It's not a game that is really designed that way. There is an opening for this kind of thing, though. Cool. And it's pretty much powered by Banshee's abilities. I can't think of a lot of other ways you would do this, but yeah, pretty interesting, so we'll dig into it. And it's interesting with survivability because, of course, avoiding enemy attacks, however you do that, is a form of survivability. Stealth can be a way that games give you more damage, but it is also weirdly sort of a form of survivability, right? If enemies don't know you're there, then you don't get attacked as much because they don't know you're there to attack. So in a way, it is a very strange form of survivability. I really like that you're taking this in this open-ended direction. Okay, let's go. This is something I've been trying to achieve in Warframe's gameplay for a long time. My efforts primarily focused on Banshee, and earlier this year I stumbled upon what could be considered actual evidence that my efforts had been finally successful. But more on that later. Combat stealth really describes one or more means of survivability, the subject of my previous parlay, falling largely within the preventing enemy attacks in the first place category I defined there. The idea being that through whatever means you have available, you make enemies not attack you, ideally by directing their attention away from you and not taking away their ability to attack. Sure, for example, a way that you could achieve a similar type of survivability a very different way would be something like a lot of dodge chance, or something like that. It would be very difficult to make a video game where the power fantasy of enemies are shooting you, but like that thing in pop culture, you manually dodge individual bullets, which is not really a thing that would exist. Well, part of the reason that it isn't a thing that can easily exist is because I don't really see how you would mentally process that. You know what I mean? Think about making that into a mechanic. You could do it, I'm sure. It would probably involve slowing down time. Super Hot comes to mind, if that is a game people are still familiar with. That idea that time only moves when you move, or things move very slowly when you're not moving, and therefore you can do really sick dodges of bullets and stuff, but the whole game is built around just achieving that one thing. It would be very difficult in an action game like Warframe to find a way to create that form of survivability. An interesting way to use your previous parlay with different categories of survivability would just be, how do you put this type of survivability in this type of game? And that will lead to lots of really interesting concepts, many of which could be their own whole games. There might be, if you were to analyze it fully enough, types of survivability we basically don't see in modern gaming that much, but that would be cool and make total sense. But you would just have to sort of figure through, okay, what forms of survivability do we generally not give the player, and then why, and then is there a way you could do it? And then in some cases, yes, but you might have to build the whole game around it. I wouldn't be surprised if that's where Super Hot came from, besides it obviously coming from other fantasies like John Wick as well. I don't know the order of the provenance of those games. Give me a break. Anyway, very interesting. Warframe doesn't really have a super straightforward way for you to just straight up avoid enemy bullets, though that happens sometimes. There's some bullet heli, that's fun, little sequences in Warframe. But this is kind of a way to do it. So why Banshee? Her relationship with survivability has always been that of a problem for the player to solve. Her overall functional design is that of an odd glass cannon support, being able to rather effortlessly boost the damage output of herself and allies by a ridiculous degree, up to 25 times damage multiplier unmodded, alongside easy access to armor removal. But her base health and shield pools match Excalibur's formerly average, now low-end values, as well as having one of the lowest base armor values in the game. Yeah, I have a video from a while ago that is about how you would stay alive with every Warframe, and the goal of that video was not to actually go through every single frame. I believe I did do that, but to give the idea that there are basically 3 or so categories of how Warframe game design gives you a way to stay alive. And for my reckoning, when you look at it that way, basically every Warframe in the game has one of the ways, with the glaring exception of like just 1 or 2, literally just 1 or 2 out of like 60 Warframes. And I would say that at the time I made that video, those 2 Warframes were Banshee and Mirage asterisk. Mirage has a damage reduction ability that's really good, but at the time I made the video, you only got it when you were in the dark, which is like in Warframe's engine, that's just not clear when that is. And so, yeah, indeed, Banshee. She has tools that can help keep you alive, but not as much of like a clear layer. You know, there's been this idea in the Warframe community for a long time that when you stay alive as Banshee, you're kind of learning Warframe's combat a little more and sort of paying attention to your surroundings a little more, because you can't very easily create passive survivability on Banshee. So it went. Now, with Helminth abilities, the ability to take an ability from another Warframe and put it on Banshee, plus the inflated mods we have, I reckon if you want to use Banshee and survive a way that is analogous to the way other Warframes survive, for example, give Banshee the effective health pool tanking strategy of staying alive, just make her tanky, you can do that. I don't think that would be very difficult. But it is interesting how that kind of unmakes Banshee in a way. Why do you know? I guess for the big damage multiplier, that's why I would most likely want to do that, or maybe for fashion, you just like Banshee. But it's really cool to be exploring that unique way of staying alive that she offers. Her abilities also offer little more in the way of defense than flimsy crowd control until you look deeper. Anyone familiar with the frame knows that I'm talking about Silence, one of the vaguest and most delightfully strange ability designs I've seen in any game. What a bizarre ability, yes. Silence creates a passive aura around Banshee, with an effect that we can break down into 3 parts. 1. Enemies are briefly stunned when they enter the aura. They kind of like stumble slightly. 2. Enemy special abilities cannot be used while in the aura, such as that of Eximus units, even while they're protected by from controlling effects by their overguard. I didn't know this. That's interesting. So if an enemy has like a, I don't know, grenade or something, or they're an Eximus enemy and they have some kind of AoE they can do, like the fire Eximus enemies that can do a big flame AoE, they can't do things like that when they're in the aura. That's interesting. Okay. Why is it called Silence anyway? And 3, enemies inside the aura effectively lose access to all hearing-based perception. Yeah, I don't know. I always thought, like, is this stumble because their ear canal gets mucked up from not being able to hear? Why does Silence do thing 1 and 2? Like, what's happening? Anyway, it's magical silence, and it's like silence in a you know, in some other spellcasting heavy games. You silence the enemy's ability to spellcast, I guess, and so that's why they can't use special abilities. And then they get staggered because otherwise Banshee would be a piece of tissue paper. I don't know. The second effect is great, the ability silencing, for general defensive convenience, passively simplifying the overall combat situation. And the first effect is otherwise the most tangible one, and can be taken advantage of by simply moving around a lot, or using slowing effects, this is clever, to extend the stun. Gloom subsumed from the helmet system is a popular one, creating a second aura of similar size that slows enemies, and then the animation when they stagger from entering the silence area is performed slower, which Warframe is weird, and that makes the stun longer. That is bizarre, but that totally works, yep. But the third effect is where things really get interesting. Enemy AI in Warframe uses sound to inform its actions to a surprising degree. Enemies will get alerted by and have their attention directed towards sounds of gunfire and other enemies in combat shouting. Any Tenno who's tried to stealth a mission will be familiar with the sense that getting noticed by one enemy is like kicking a hornet's nest, with the whole hive mind network of enemy AIs quickly becoming alerted. Blocking their hearing effectively turns off this hive mind. Great way to describe what effect this has, which not only helps smooth out full-on stealth, but also makes it generally more difficult for enemies to orient themselves, as they can't rely on each other to help locate the Tenno. As a result, while silence doesn't do anything for your numbers in terms of survivability, on the surface, it can do tremendous work to generally ease the enemy pressure on the Banshee using it, as nearby enemies are blanketed in a triplet of debilitating effects. I'll append a screenshot of my build for visual reference. This is a Bionicme's build, not mine, and won't go into much further detail, but suffice it to say that the auto-regenerating properties of shields are very useful when you expect not to get hit a lot, and that gives enemies a very attractive target to focus their attention on instead with Loki's recently buffed Decoy, and as a subsumed ability that has shown great results. Here's the Archon shards. The evidence of that great result from buffed Decoy revealed themselves when I was playing in Warframe's 1999 missions, and noticed that despite being in full-on combat, I was consistently getting the lower intensity version of the soundtrack. That's a very cool detail to illustrate this working well, where the vocals were not present, as if there weren't enough enemies around for the game to consider it a sufficiently tense combat scenario for the music. And this was something I could pretty reliably turn off and on with the uptime of Silence and Decoy. This has seriously become my favorite and most reliable build in terms of survivability, as well as damage output, and I appreciate this opportunity to spend way too many words showcasing it. In short, not get shot, good. Sure is. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think it's bad to have some parlay that are just you want to, like, this is a very cool example of a thing. And there's still plenty to talk about. I mean, again, from a game design perspective, there's a lot to say about the idea that this is a form of staying alive that maybe you don't get as often in a lot of games. And I really love that detail of the game giving you a way to indicate that. That's so satisfying, isn't it? Just having an example of, oh, the soundtrack has like a thing it does when, you know, the combat is of a certain intensity, and it didn't do that, which gave you an audio cue that you're sort of in that layer. A lot of games probably do that, but I'm not sure I've noticed it that much. I just usually don't favor this playstyle, but I like the idea of it. I think it would be cool to see, I don't know, I guess like games that are built more around it. You know, a glaring thing in the back of my mind about Warframe is that co-op pretty much butchers the idea of playing this way. And I would argue that Warframe just isn't a decisive enough game for this type of thing to be as exciting as it could be for a picky person like me. But I love the idea of, I'm happy you're having fun with this. I want to think about how it could be in other games. Like immediately my first thought is people would like this, you know, that sounds fun. And from a game design perspective, there's a lot to learn from here. You know, in some sense, I feel like I'm being mean. Warframe has put this thing, just one Warframe, that has a full combat loop that is potentially different to every other part of the game, just inside of the game as one of 60 different options. It sounds good when you put it like that. You know, if I were to be critical, and I don't think it is interesting to focus too much on that in this parlay, I don't think this is a place where, for example, like modding is at its best. I feel like if that is a thing that is possible, this is a place where we see a drawback of a build system where a lot of people don't know you could do this because you need to set up your build in a certain way for it to be like 100% possible. Or the game doesn't really make it that clear that alert levels work like this. Or again, co-op makes it seem sort of like you wouldn't even think to try something like this. I really admire that you thought outside of the box enough to think, yeah, that could probably work, and then gave it a try. But I think it would be very strong if a game were about doing this. If a game was focused on the player doing this. For another example, I would argue that Warframe doesn't especially reward playing this way. That doesn't really matter, but I mean, it would be good if a game did. It's no knock against you doing it. I think I'm very happy you did it. But it would be fun to have a game that was kind of built around you doing this thing, right? I don't know, some kind of score multiplier that you get the most of some kind of benefit, or the most loot. Maybe you could do this in Warframe. You get more loot if you are not undetected and not fully detected, but instead in this kind of combat stealth area, the soundtrack is that volume, and at that point you get more loot. Maybe you could do this in Warframe. And I think that if you made this a thing people knew about, in Warframe, it would cause problems because, again, it is kind of impractical to do this in co-op. But you could imagine a game where that could be very rewarding. I mean, I still think that would be sort of cool in Warframe. I just understand that would be chaotic for the game's current design. So you see what I mean? It would be kind of fun to have a game that supports that way of playing entirely. I think this is one of the places where you can see the benefits of thinking of these things in games as being not really what the game is rewarding. It's not the behavior the game heavily encourages, but it's really cool that this or that player did this thing, and then to extrapolate that and say, okay, what would it take for the game to be kind of about that, decisively about that? And in this case, I think one of the things is that it be rewarding in some way. It doesn't necessarily need to be easier to do than being undetected or fully detected. It could just be that it could be it's harder to do, but you get more for doing it. I think in many ways, this is inherently going to be the hardest approach. If you're fully detected, in like kind of any game, I think, you don't have to worry about any the like detection level thing is off your plate, right? You don't need to do that. I literally just punched my secondary webcam directly in the face. You don't have to worry about any of your surroundings. Let me just okay, sorry. Probably getting the pay docked there from the old boss, but fortunately that's me. And if you're completely undetected, yeah, you do need to worry about being detected, but also you have like the full advantage of not being detected, right? You don't really need to ideally actively manage being detected. If I don't know, you're playing Cyberpunk 2077, you ambush a guy, kill him, and then Cyberpunk does this thing where there are just bins everywhere that you can stuff people in. It's strange, but I guess in urban society this is kind of true, sort of like a dumpster or something that is unlocked, which is not that realistic. They're always unlocked. Or like a big bin that you could use to do like laundry at a hotel, for example. These are just absolutely everywhere in Cyberpunk 2077. And so a lot of the time, if you kill someone and you haven't been detected anymore, if you put their body in one of those bins, these are a trash can for your detection risk, basically. Once you have completed that loop, you are now like back to zero. It's as if you haven't been detected at all. You've lost no opportunity, really, as long as you clean up. And this is what is different, I think, about being undetected and being in the combat stealth zone. I would argue that the combat stealth thing is you need to maintain a tension, because sort of as you said, if you maintain the uptime of your silence and Loki's decoy in this build with Banshee, you are maintaining that state of tension. And if you stop doing it, then you'll be fully detected, or I guess you could kill everybody or retreat, and then you would be undetected. And so you have to actively work to stay in this spot. You could probably make a game where you don't need to do that, but to me, it feels like that's sort of the fun part, don't you think? You're sort of in a tension between these two things. So that would be a thing that I would want to maintain if you built a game around this. I would at least start with the idea that the player maintains their position in here, which does something. So, I don't know, for another example, it could be that rather than dumping the body, Cyberpunk 2077, you dump it in a gurney or whatever. Maybe you could imagine something like, okay, so we delete all those. There's no place to dump the body. You could maybe vaporize the body. maybe this is an option the game offers you, but you got a limited number of those. And so the thing the game will offer is you can put a cloaking device on the enemy so that their body is invisible, but you need to keep it charged or keep enemies from kicking it over or something, keep enemies away from there. And so you can hide the bodies and remain undetected. You can fight nearby with bodies all over the floor, but people just can't see them. But you need to maintain that somehow. There's like some way that you prevent enemies from like further noticing that. Enemies in Warframe, I actually don't know what would happen if you sort of tried to do this, but I feel like enemies in Warframe are as bad at seeing you as they are good at hearing you. And so I don't think that you would need to worry about this very much. You could just have it's Warframe, you know. This is not a good society. If there's just a dead body on the ground, people are just like, another Tuesday, you know. So maybe it's fine. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to have it be that you need to maintain the cloaking the bodies thing is so contrived, but I don't know. You have it's a psychic ability game, and you mentally cloud the minds of the people near you, but you can only do so much, you know. I'm thinking of being able to manipulate people's emotions a little bit. You know, it's not mind control, but you can make them just a little too relaxed, such that, oh, that guy's just sleeping, you know. And if you were to leave, that effect would go away and they would immediately be on alert. And so if you kill an enemy, you need to be near their body so that nobody freaks out, or at least block the way to their bodies. You could imagine something like a circuit. Let's start with a corridor, actually. You have a corridor-shaped level, so it's a straight line. As long as you kill enemies in order, you put yourself in a situation where your bubble of people chilling out about seeing dead bodies on the ground progresses with you, preventing people who would be scared of you killing all of their friends from passing through it and seeing, oh no, on this side of the bubble, there's a bunch of dead people. Can you imagine this? You kill the first person, you've got your bubble up. Now the people that can see that person on the ground are going, oh, it's fine for some reason. And the people up here just can't see. You kill more people. There is an area down here where your bubble is not there. You're not psychically chilling people out. They would freak out if they saw the dead bodies on the ground. But your bubble and your presence is blocking people from here from getting down there and freaking out. You can now imagine how if you made level designs that were like, for example, a square, you know, like a circuit, a circle or something like that, or a more complicated, a mansion, imagine something like this, and you go in and assassinate enemies in there, and this is your way to kind of deal with the bodies. You might have a really, really interesting time carefully clearing out the routes for, you know, which way you want to clear enemies out. In Warframe, there's a lot of positioning that matters, but most of it is like you get enemies into a favorable kill box, or enemies will spawn and navigate into this room fast so that you can kill them quickly. Basically, a lot of it isn't about, you know, it matters that much what order you clear rooms in. Maybe it does with this playstyle, actually, that you've mentioned, but it would be interesting to kind of build that into such a game and create an experience where the player wanted to clear rooms in a very certain order because their abilities kind of restrict their ability to deal with that somehow. I don't know why there's so many guards in this mansion. I feel like that's kind of unrealistic, but you could figure it out. You could make up any excuse for that, of course. So yeah, I think that's neat. There is also the route of simply disabling people's senses directly, more similar to what you're doing here, but not in a bubble. And so something like Cyberpunk 2077, again, the hacking. You can often kind of fiddle with people's, for example, optics. Everybody has artificial eyes in Cyberpunk 2077, so you can hack someone and make their eyes not work. They're blinded, you know, technologically blinded. Something like that. And so you can pick out, in Cyberpunk, you can pick out specific enemies to have not have a certain sense. I would say in exchange, the hacking is just broken in Cyberpunk, but like, I suppose in exchange for not being able to passively project an aura that prevents people from using a whole sense, like hearing in your case. That's an interesting trade-off. A reined in version of the Cyberpunk hacking could then be very interesting here. You very carefully I don't know, for example, in Cyberpunk, there's this idea that you have an amount of RAM that you can use to actively process hacks. You know, the part of your computer that does things actively and holds things in random access memory. That's what it's called, right? As opposed to your computer's like storage type memory, your hard drive or whatever. Cyberpunk uses this as a mechanic to govern how much stuff you can do at once. I don't believe this is actually the way the game works. It's been a minute since I played hacking, but it would be interesting to go a step further and say, okay, well, you can only blind one enemy. You can only have that kind of going at one time, and then a fourth of your RAM has to be taken up keeping that enemy blinded. And then, you know, you can maybe make one enemy puke their guts up and another enemy can't hear. And for some contrived technological reason, that doesn't really make sense. Maybe a magical reason. Maybe you control evil spirits and you only have one of each and you can have them possess specific people. That makes much more sense to me. So you can only control certain people's senses and you want to do a combat stealth thing. The game has rewarded that somehow. Maybe you create magical tension from being in that combat stealth area, and this is somehow, I don't know, charges your abilities or cultivates your inner power being in that state of tension. That's very odd, but okay. I don't know. That sounds cool. And so you want to carefully pick whose senses you disable. You start in this kind of undetected state. You carefully enter the combat stealth fantasy by choosing whose senses to fiddle with. And then after doing that most of the way, you probably just drop the pretense and brawl the last few enemies. I would imagine a good way to do this is to make it so getting flanked is very bad. That is, you can duel an individual enemy, make the player character, very good at dueling individual enemies, or make that the thing the combat is good at, but make the player devastatingly bad at fighting when flanked, and or make the AI very good, like ridiculously good, at fighting the player when flanked. So if you run away and get enemies in choke point, you could live, but you want to retreat, versus if you get surrounded, if you go in, you know, guns, evil spirits blazing, I don't know, then you probably die. And so then you've encouraged the player, they kind of have to do it in this order, but also they sort of want to maximize the time that they're in the combat stealth thing. I think that sounds extremely fun. And when I put it this way, I know some people probably who've played Warframe are thinking, okay, but I don't want to do Bionicme's combat stealth thing. I bet some people do, but I bet a lot of people are thinking, but in Warframe, eh. But all you have to do is figure out why that is. It's not that you have something engraved in your soul or whatever that means you wouldn't enjoy this and Bionicme would. There is some reason why it doesn't appeal to the people it doesn't appeal to, and we could find and change that reason. Though again, you would likely need to make a whole game around it for many people. Yeah, I don't know. I've always felt like Warframe also sort of not stumbled, but like I've never been that attracted to the stealth in Warframe, partly because it's very you don't get the thing you often get in stealth heavy games where enemies will give you a little indicator that they have noticed you in a way that I find as readable, I guess. Again, it might be that there actually are pretty good signs for this, but I'm just saying, to me, that didn't totally fire. And having a game where you have those pop-ups can be useful. You know when enemies are detecting you. You get a sound cue and a little eyeball. It's always something like that that shows you that somebody is watching you or aware of you or whatever. But again, in some ways, I feel like those tools are almost too strong. In a way, they encourage you to stay in this layer. Finding a way to make tools like that where you don't stay in this layer, but you don't just go straight to combat seems useful. I'm not sure how you would do that. You could say that in Warframe, the fact that there aren't as clear those indications means that combat usually erupts into violence, and Banshee's silence is a way to just kind of shut off the noise, and thus you can enter the combat stealth layer. It's because there are no notifications for, or not no notifications, but because it's chaotic when you get detected, basically, that you can't easily have it be that the game keeps you in this stealth area. If you get noticed one time, most builds are just caught, like you're now in the normal layer. So that's interesting to think about, like how you notify the player. I can't really think of, I don't know. And I'm not a player who's played a lot of stealth games generally, or has previously enjoyed this type of formula, but it's always fascinated me. So I'm happy we get to spend some time waffling about that. in this parlay. Um, yeah, I also wanted to talk about why we kind of already covered it, but I also wanted to bring up why a lot of people probably haven't tried to do something like this previously. I brought up this thing before that you could probably make a lot of more people excited to do this in Warframe if you made it so there were other benefits that balance opportunity cost. There kind of are on Banshee. You are encouraged to stay alive with this somewhat janky ability, Silence. Never mind that you can do it in a way that makes you tanky. Let's say you couldn't, but you get something else, big damage. People played Banshee before there was as much support for doing this kind of thing. And part of the reason they did that is because even though they traded away some passive survivability, which some of them valued, they gained huge damage. As you say, Banshee's damage multipliers are ludicrous, obviously as an attempt to counterbalance the fact that you do the thing. Another thing we haven't mentioned is that Banshee's sonar that creates the big epic weakness points also, if I recall, lets you see, like, notice enemies through walls in a more intuitive way. You can have enemy sense and see them on the minimap, but this lets you see, oh, there's an enemy kind of over there a little bit. Doesn't it do that? And that helps you keep track of enemies in physical space were you to embrace this like combat stealth thing. So for a lot of people, I think that big damage was enough of a carrot. But then also I suggested, well, what if being in combat stealth literally gave you more loot? So yeah, you probably kill enemies slower than if you just blow up the whole room, but you could just make it so the player gets, again, whatever, loot experience maybe in some other games, such that they would, it would counterbalance that. And it could feel fulfilling to play that way if you wanted to. This is something I would appreciate in, like, I don't know, the Assassin's Creed games, for example. In Assassin's Creed Unity, I think it was, I had this thing where I was running around with a pepperbox pistol and smoke grenades, and you could just Rambo into a whole crowd, alley-oop a smoke grenade in there, and shoot until that pepperbox is nice and toasty. And you would get a ton of kills and a ton of loot or money or whatever the heck you get in that game. And it was great and not stealth at all. And that's fine. But I would have enjoyed being more subtle. It just wasn't beneficial to do that, in my estimation. Now, this isn't perfectly objective. Like, every player will have their own sense about this. Why don't more people just, like, do the combat stealth thing anyway, if they just want to? Why do you feel comfortable doing that versus other people don't? And I think this is a mercurial aspect of humans. We can share similar tastes. You can acquire other tastes. You're not just engraved with the exact things you enjoy at birth or something. You can enjoy other things. But there is some mysterious way by which people find it, like, worth it at a certain threshold, and those thresholds are different. The amount of reward you need to give someone for them to think that it's rewarding or worth it to behave a certain way varies by a lot, which is surprising simply because you can also acquire the same perspective. That's very weird that would be the case. That we can all enjoy a similar thing, but we ask for different amounts of reward before we enjoy it. That seems odd, I would say. I think that's strange. And I don't know why that is, so I'm not going to... Yeah, I don't know why that is. But the point I'm trying to make is that for a lot of people, I think it's worth asking, well, what would make you interested in this? What would cause you to want to do this? Since I can't ever know why Bionicme would want to enjoy it. I think that's most of my notes. This was a shorter one. I'm happy that you shared this, and I hope you didn't mind me waffling for almost the entire rest of the duration about, like, what I want to see in a combat stealth game. It's fascinating that this is the thing that you can kind of detect with the soundtrack thing is something I'm really focused on as well. That's very cool. Having it be that the player being in different modes causes you to hear a version of the soundtrack is something a lot of games have, but this is a case where it's arguably kind of useful in combat to do that. You can kind of monitor how things are going a little bit. You could even imagine, I'm not sure this would be that usable, but you could even imagine a game that had sort of like the volume of certain instruments, let's just go all the way, certain instruments in the soundtrack, indicating certain qualities to the player a little bit to help make those less tangible things more tangible, but in a way where you want it to be more vague. Going back to my thing about the stealth indicators before. Yeah, in a lot of games where you're trying to go full stealth, the game will give you some kind of indicator of did the enemy notice you or how close are they to noticing you. But in this game, well, you've kind of been you're not detected, but like you're actively attacking enemies. You're not like carefully making sure nobody ever sees. This guy right here does see you, but you've just kept that contained somehow. And so it would be interesting to see if you could indicate that better with something not really more subtle, but just more vague. In other words, than like a raw gauge. That's very interesting. The soundtrack detail is awesome. I kind of want to hear that. Maybe I'll do this and hear that. That sounds very interesting. So thank you for the parlay. Folks, if you'd like to submit your own parlay like this one, it can be about whatever you like. You can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.